This is section 7.3. It's called factoring trinomials with a leading coefficient of 1. Now, if you saw my video on section 7.2, we talked about how to know which kind of factoring to use. And if you remember, the last thing we learned was factor by grouping, and factor by grouping requires 4 terms. This one is different. In fact, you can tell from the name, it says factoring trinomials. And you may remember, but trinomials have 3 terms. So that's how you know which method to use. If it's got 4 terms, check grouping. Grouping doesn't always work, but that's what you should check. If it's got 3 terms, we're going to do the following procedure. And the following procedure can be a little more complicated, a little more simple. There are some shortcuts, but I'm going to show you the general process, and then I'm going to show you the shortcuts afterwards. So first the process, then we'll do the shortcuts. So, okay, here's the idea. There are 4 steps to this method. Here is the first step. You multiply the first coefficient times the last. Coefficient times the last. Now, this is already one of the places where you may be able to take a shortcut, and I will tell you why. If the leading coefficient, this part here, if the leading coefficient is 1, that is this guy right here. The leading coefficient is the first coefficient. If the first coefficient is 1, your multiplication is not going to change anything. Let me show you what I mean. There's an invisible 1 here. We're going to multiply this guy times this guy. But 1 times 72 is just 72. So the result of step 1, it's just going to be that last number. Whatever the last number is, you're just going to multiply by 1. But one more time, you multiply the first coefficient times the last. Sometimes the first coefficient is 1, in which case it won't change anything. But we still want to do these steps because they'll be more relevant later. So we multiply the first coefficient times the last. Step 2. Make that prettier. Step 2 is going to be split. Nope, we're not going to do that yet. We're going to find 2 numbers, then we'll know how to split it. We're going to find 2 numbers. And this is the key step. It's kind of a harder step because it takes some thought. But if you can do this, you got it. You got the whole process. So we're going to find 2 numbers that, and I always write it like this. I write blank times blank equals. And then I write blank plus blank equals. So the 2 numbers need to multiply to be this guy. They multiply to be the result of step 1. In this case, it's 72. So 2 numbers that multiply to be 72. And they add to be the middle coefficient. So they have to add to be negative 22. Let me write that all out. So they have to multiply to be the result of step 1. They multiply to be the result of step 1. And they add to be the middle coefficient. So, and they add to be the middle coefficient. In this case, my middle coefficient, which I need another line to write the word coefficient. In this case, my middle coefficient is negative 22. So they multiply to be the result of step 1, in this case 72, and they add to be the middle coefficient, negative 22. Now this is the hard part. You're just going to have to think of numbers. You just kind of brainstorm. If I were you, I would emphasize this line because this line has a smaller list of numbers. There's not as many things that multiply to be 72. So you might just off to the side make a little list of things that multiply to be 72. For example, 36 times 2 is 72. 18 times 4. Or let's see, 9 times 8. There's more than this. You could keep going. And then you might also want to consider the negative options. So the negative options would be like negative 36 and negative 2, because those also multiply to be 72. Or negative 18 and negative 4. Or negative 9 and negative 8, and so on. There's more than this. You'll have to think through it. But this is going to be a shorter list than the other one. So if you've got a list of numbers that you've written down, you can just process of elimination. Which ones of these add to be negative 22? Well, this adds to be 38, so not that. I can cross it off. This adds to be 22, so close. In fact, so close that I should check this guy over here. Negative 18 and negative 4, hey, that adds to be negative 22. So those are my two numbers. I found them. The answer is negative 18 and negative 4. And I like to fill in the blanks and just double check it. Negative 18 times negative 4, yep, that is in fact 72. Negative 18 plus negative 4, yep, that is in fact negative 22. So if you've mastered step 2, you are good to go. Now I'm going to show you step 3, but the good news is there are shortcuts for step 3 and step 4 if your first coefficient is 1. We'll get to that. But here's step 3. Step 3, you're going to split up the middle coefficient. Actually, I'm going to say the middle term. Split up the middle term. So here's what I mean. We're going to take this guy. And instead of negative 22n, I'm going to split it. So the n squared will stay the same. The plus 72 will stay the same. But instead of negative 22n, I'm going to split it. And I'm going to split it into these two numbers that we found. So I'm going to do minus 18n and minus 4n. I like to call this step uncombining like terms. We are uncombining like terms. And if you know about factor by grouping, you might know why. We had 3 terms, but when we uncombined them, we now have 4. 4 terms makes it a good candidate for factor by grouping. And in fact, that is step 4. Factor by grouping. So to factor by grouping, you probably already know how to do this, so this isn't going to take a whole lot of work. You can watch the previous video if you need to, but we're going to put parentheses around the first 2, and then we're going to stick a little plus so that we don't separate a number from its negative. We put parentheses around the next 2, and then we take out what each term has in common. Each group has in common. So the first group has n in common. If I take it out, I'm left with n minus 18. The second group, I need to take out a negative because the first one is negative, and then they both divide by 4. So I'm going to divide both by negative 4, and I'm left with n, and then you can check it with a calculator, but 72 divided by negative 4 is negative 18. Now I am almost finished. I've got this big first term and this big second term, and they both have n minus 18. So I'm going to take that out and write down what's left. In the first term, I'm left with n. In the second term, I'm left with minus 4. And this is my final answer. Now that we've learned the steps, I am going to tell you about a shortcut. Let's go back to step 2. In step 2, we found 2 numbers, negative 18 and negative 4. And you might notice those 2 numbers showed up at the very end. In fact, we did not need step 3 or step 4, but that is only true because our leading coefficient was 1. If the first term is a 1, you can skip these last 2 steps. Let me write that down. So you can skip these steps if and only if the first coefficient is a 1. Let me do one more example to make sure that you get what I mean. So here's another question. We're going to factor this, and I'm only going to worry about really the first 2 steps. Then I'm just going to write my answer. So step 1 will stay the same, even though it's not very significant. You are going to multiply the first coefficient times the last. Well, 1 times negative 90 is going to give you negative 90. So there you go. That's step 1. Step 2 is the one that takes some thought. Step 2 is you're going to find 2 numbers. And the 2 numbers need to do this. They need to multiply to be negative 90, the result of step 1, and they need to add to be the middle coefficient, which is negative 9. Again, you might just want to make like a list of things that multiply to be negative 90. So like negative 9 and positive 10, or maybe 9 and negative 10. Well, those don't add to be negative 9, so we try again. You might say, well, what about negative 4 and what's that? Nope, not negative 4. Negative 5 times, wait, hang on. 95, no, I'm right. Negative 5 times 18. Okay, and then over here you might do 5 times negative 18. Well, those are still not adding to be 9, so we try again. Then the next one we might say is, let's see, what else multiplies to be negative 90? How about 3 and 30? Negative 3 and 30, or 3 and negative 30. No, none of these are adding to 9 still. So what about 45 and 2? Or 2 and negative 45? No. Oops, 2 and negative 45. 9 times 10, 5 times 18, 3 times 30. We're still not getting it. What about 6 times 15? Well, make this negative. Aha, I think I found it. 6 and 15, if you add these together, you do in fact get negative 9, so I did it. Negative 16 plus 15 will give you positive 9. It's these 2 that will give you negative 9. So I would normally say close. This one is right. And then let's put these numbers here and we'll check it. So we've got 6 and negative 15, 6 and negative 15, and you check it. You say, well, 6 times negative 15, yep, that is in fact negative 90. And then you can say 6 plus negative 15. Yep, that is in fact negative 9. So we did it. We found 2 numbers. Now, I am done. Because my leading coefficient is 1, I can skip the rest of the steps and I can just write my answer. So really, I'm just going to say skip steps 3 through 4, and you just write the answer. Here's the answer. Parentheses, V, and then you put this number, so plus 6, close parentheses. Then you do one more parentheses, V, and you do this number, minus 15. That's it. This is the answer to factoring the above problem.